Here is our Milky Way galaxy. Now, okay, you already know where we're at, because you can probably already see it on the graph. However, if we look down below it a bit, here is a certain point, right around this part, around the very bottom of the Milky Way. And there is something fairly unique. While most of it is just comprised of many stars, and many planets orbiting those stars, there is something also very, very unique that was only thought to be unique to Earth. What is that? That is life. Life on Earth can have many various forms. Some are predators, some are strange arboreal organisms, some can have various colors, some can be very rotund, others can have armor, and others, well, are just giant living beasts in the ocean. But in my opinion, I do not think that life is only on Earth. There are more planets than grains of sand on Earth, and that's actually mind-boggling. So, I do not believe that there's only just life on Earth. It doesn't even have to be intelligent or even multicellular. It can be just bacteria on the surface of Mars or in the seas of Europa. However, I do believe it's out there, somewhere. And thus, I am going to create my own project exploring what life could be like in a planet and its own, story being told in its whole natural history. Which is going to be a very fun task, I guess. However, I have to admit, I'm not entirely just going to go off of this on my own. I am very much so inspired by many projects which led to me wanting to create this own world, should I say. And those projects are Project Zero, Project Apollo, Project Solar, and Project Methania, as well as the original alien biospheres. So, they are going to lead me to create this whole new project that is probably not going to get a lot of attention, but I don't really mind because I'm just doing this for fun. So, with that out of the way, I would like you to meet the main project, Nova Terra, an alien's world natural history, which is basically just explains the name. We'll be visiting a solar system called Nova Terra, and we'll be exploring the alien worlds that inhabit it. Well, mainly one, but perhaps two. We'll get into that. But we're going to explore their natural history and a bunch of other stuff like that. So, if you do like this and you want to see more, well then, you can join me in the next episode when I get it out. Don't know when that's going to be, but maybe soon, I don't know. But, okay, if we're going to make an entire project, we need to know what kind of star it's orbiting first. So, in this particular point where the project is set place, what kind of star would it be orbiting, the main planet? Well, I chose one of my favorite star types that I really do like, which is the K-type star. And this is the main star we'll be talking about, and it's the main star, of course. This is Hades, or Hades 178136. So, a very long name, but we're just going to call it Hades. Hades is, well, of course, like I said, a K-type star. So it's a little smaller than our sun and doesn't emit that much light, but it can still emit some light. And perhaps some life forms can, well, evolve on planets that orbit it. We'll just have to see, right? But it's going to be the main thing that lights the way for the planets that we'll be talking about today in this episode. Speaking of, what are some planets that are out there? This planet right here is Zagreus. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Zagreus, or Zagreus 178-88, is a tidally locked planet. And if you don't know what tidally locked means, it means that one side of a planet experiences a never-ending day, and one experiences a never-ending night. However, due to this, and due to its close proximity to the star, it has no atmosphere, and has a very weak magnetic field, as it's only around the size of Mars, as it's also being stripped away by the star. And it has no moons, and is definitely not habitable, so no life. And we will not be talking about it much in the series at all. In fact, this is probably going to be the only time we ever talk about it. Maybe. But we're going to have to leave it for now and move on to the next planet. This is the main focus for the planet that we'll be talking about. The main focus. This is Terra. Terra is, of course, the main focus. Or Terra 136.78. This planet is very habitable. It's also very warm and very tropical. It has 2 moons. One is smooth and one is more like an asteroid. The first moon, and the one that is smooth like our moon, or more spherical, is Primus. And the one that is not so smooth and is more like an asteroid is Scutus. And these moons, since there are 2, they will make the tides on Terra very strong. This planet is also almost entirely an ocean world, making up almost 80% of its surface, which means this is a very thick ocean world, and the ocean life may be pretty unique. However, we're going to be talking about it here in a little bit. Let me just mention the other planets first, okay? We'll get back to it soon. The next planet is Aether, or Aether 180.C7b. This planet is a very large planet. It is even larger than the biggest planet in our solar system, Jupiter, which can make it a very big gas giant. It has many moons. And in fact, in this drawing, it doesn't even count all the moons that it has. But it has very much. Wait, hang on a second. Before we talk about some of the moons, I need to talk about something else. This planet, the Aether, has many storms. Various that are giant, almost the size of Earth. And, well, that is pretty scary. However, if we look at one of its moons, we can see that it has oceans and ice on it. This beautiful moon is called Mula. Mula, or Mula 180-A37b, is the largest moon that it has, and if it wasn't orbiting it, it could be considered its own planet, as this moon is the size of Mars. However, this moon most likely has its own life forming, as it has water around a thin equator and large ice caps. So, though it is cold, it may actually be brewing life. And since it is very big, it has its own sort of magnetic field. So, it could indeed harbor life. And maybe this life could be formed through hydrothermal vents, which could be heating up its equator as well. Who knows? Maybe we might talk about this beautiful moon in the future. Who knows? If you want me to, then you can ask me to, or I can put up a vote. But we might visit it soon. The next planet, and the very last planet, well, actually, no, it's not the last planet. It's sort of the last planet, but you'll see what I mean. This is Iceless. The Iceless, or Iceless 423.87b, is an ice giant, very similar to the size of Uranus, or Uranus, should I say. It's not that. It has large rings akin to Saturn, made up of ice and rock and sand particles. And it has 2 moons, Loom and Room, which are very blue moons that have various parts of ice in it. Now, nothing much is else to say about it, except it is a very bright blue ring planet and is very beautiful. The last sort of planet, should I say, even though it's not really a planet, it's more of a dwarf planet. This is Slu. Slu is a lonely dwarf planet. It has very strange yellowish rock on it. and a strange sort of whitish bend around the equator of it. It has somehow managed to pull a small asteroid from an asteroid belt to become its small moon, known as Boo. We will not be talking about this small dwarf planet much, even though I owe it much love, I can't really give it. So, we won't be talking about it too much. Which is sad. Guys, show more love to your dwarf planets out there. Back to the main focus is Terra. Now, we need to talk about something. How could this planet even get its oceans? And it's like, how could it get all this stuff? Well, it all comes down from one thing. We'll talk about the thing here in a second, but we need to talk about something even more important. Just kidding, it's not really that important, but it's still very keen to make a planet. It's tectonic activity. Here we can see the land masses, which I will name soon, as I do not have the names down yet, but I will soon get it done by at least episode 2, so don't worry. But this land still exists. They're not that big, and they are small island chains near it. But of course, like any good project, we'll have to show them how they drift. I will show you how they drift now. And that is the tectonic activity of it, through the beginning stages of its ocean and life to all the way to the end of it. So, as you can see, it definitely has a pretty keen tectonic activity going around on its surface. And inside of its atmosphere, we can find it has a lot of nitrogen, a lot of oxygen, some good carbon dioxide, and other gases making up its atmosphere. On land, it is barren. Very strange. In the poles, even though at this point there is no ice in the poles, it is still very cold, but by the equator, it can be still very, very warm. But there's no life. It's just hard rock and sand, which is not very exciting. However, by the ocean, it can be warm or cold, but it's definitely got something brewing beneath it. But if we're going to talk about this, how did this place even get its ocean in the first place? Well, it all has to do with the rings of Aeschylus. Well, how did it form its rings in the first place? A rogue planet, which has been unnamed, entered the system of Nova Terra. It hit Aeschylus, which broke it up into many shards, making Aeschylus's ring. However, more shards flung at many planets, landing in it. It hit planets like Aeschylus, of course. It hit Mula, which is what gave its oceans to this beautiful moon. And it definitely hit Terra, and perhaps even it hit Aether. So, Terra got its oceans from this. Now, the oceans did not have life in it, but it did have water, which is definitely, of course, a key component for it. And, of course, for Mula, definitely. And perhaps even Aether in its atmosphere, but who knows. This caused a lot of undersea volcanoes to erupt, spewing out chemicals from the core and crust of the planet. Very nauseous lava flows on land and in the water. This makes a very rich chemicals in the water. Chemicals stir up all over, but especially chemicals like, well, I mean, it doesn't sound that important. I mean, it's just chemicals. I mean, what chemicals are there? Well, chemicals like carbon. However, this is very important. Some of these chemicals began to join together, forming longer chains of molecules. And eventually, some of these molecules, after bonding, eventually began to self-replicating their each other, and eventually formed a protection around them. The first cell, with the first DNA. We don't know what this cell would look like, but we do know that it is the last universal common ancestor to all life on Terra, which would give rise to the various types of cells like prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And this is the most important thing that ever happened to this project. These cells started to grow and form. Luca is also most likely happened on Earth, of course, to give rise to all forms of life. So, the plant that you have in your pot and you and your pet cat can all trace their origins back to a Luca, which is very interesting. The Luca eventually gave rise to the first prokaryotic cells, or bacteria. Most of the bacteria were simple and most likely heterotrophic, meaning that they had to eat other organisms in order to survive, basically other bacteria. Some of them, however, were chemotrophic, which make them in the group of autotrophs, allowing them to chemosynthesize and feed upon chemicals from hydrothermal vents, and formed great thick mats of these chemotrophs growing on the sides of these, hydrothermal vents, just sucking up matter like sulfur and other things. Some of them even developed sharp appendages near the top to sharply siphon them and stab into other bacteria. These bacteria were less evolved and advanced, no more than genetic material in a shell, so they are more keen to stuff like viruses and more than any other thing, mainly stuff like bacteriophage. I hope I pronounced that right. However, some bacteria may even go up onto the top of the ocean, but you might be wondering, well, how are they going to get their food? Well, they could use a form of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is converting the sunlight into usable energy and sugars. Now, they may take drastically different colors. Some may be green, some may be red, some may be yellow, and some may be predominantly teal. Most photosynthetic life forms may take on a more teal color more than anything else, which is cool, and what also is the reason why this planet, Terra, has so much oxygen. However, is this world just going to be a bunch of bacteria? That doesn't sound very exciting. I mean, while bacteria is very resilient, its multicellular stuff would just be carpets of stinky gush in the bottom of the sea. However, it will not stay this way. Some bacteria may develop something. Some of these bacteria may develop to work together. These bacteria may fuse into one, but instead of metabolizing each other into energy, they may instead work together in order to survive, eventually developing into the first eukaryotic cells. The first eukaryotic cells may be a sort of mix of heterotrophs and chemotrophs, sort of feeding on chemicals and eating other bacteria, except they are not a bacteria anymore, they're a eukaryotic cell. These eukaryotic cells also might independently develop into autotrophs. Mainly, they're already sort of autotrophs, but they may develop photosynthesis in some variants, the first plant cells. Some also may stick to the heterotroph lifestyle, not developing themselves with the autotrophs, thus developing into the first animal cells. And some of these cells would actually work together as well, using their sort of glue around their outer layering to fuse together to form multicellular structures. These structures may be a bit more complex because these cells are a bit more complex than bacteria, so their structures will be very complex, thus resulting into sort of chemotrophic or chemoplankton. These plankton would mainly do chemosynthesis. However, they may also feed on small bacteria. So they're a mix of chemotrophs and autotrophs. They're a mix of chemotrophs and heterotrophs. And they may develop into multicellular life forms. This organism right here is a very tall, stinky bulb with two long antennae-like structures on the top of the bulb. You might be wondering, well, what the hell is this? What is that? Well, it's a sort of chemosynthetic eukaryote, sort of. The antennae structures are actually its gametangia, somewhat similar to a plant. The longer, more curved gametangia is actually the male. The sort of shorter one is the female. And they spew out gametes in the water in a form of broadcast spawning. And once the gametes form together and fertilize each other, they become a larvae. They have a larva stage, that's right. The larva stage mainly eats stuff. It doesn't really do chemosynthesis. It mainly eats small chemoplankton and other things, using its antennae to feel around and grab up small things. They are so small that they don't even have blood. Instead, they mainly rely on a simple tail to swim around, which makes them resemble a tadpole. Eventually, however, they settle in the ground and begin to form their adult stage, eventually turning their antennae into the gametangia. And their tail, well, we'll talk about what the tail becomes later. So, then they form into a giant bulb. However, there is a main problem. Chemosynthesis may not just be enough to sustain a large, or relatively large, multicellular life form forever. So, similar to their larvae, they may eat things. But how could they eat things? They may grow mycelium-like roots around, which is derived from their tail as a larva. They will then begin to feed on marine snow, or bacteria mats. Marine snow being the dead bodies, fecal matter, and other things of the sorts from dead animals or cells, allowing them to feed upon it with great quantities, thus allowing them to reach their giant sizes, well, for this time at least. However, if there is no partners to reproduce with, they may do a form of asexual reproduction. This asexual reproduction will be known as budding, and they may do something similar. They may grow a bud on the tips of their mycelium tentacles, and this bud will eventually grow into a giant adult, not having a larval stage, which is a very neat way of reproduction. Now, the plant cells may also be evolving. It's not just going to be these chemosynthetic cellular life forms that dwell in the bottom. Instead, they will also be adapting. They may form great quantities of this phytoplankton. Phytoplankton being, well, of course, like plankton made up of plants. Some of them may form long chains, others may develop box-like protection, and some may develop tentacles to swim, and even perhaps light-sensing patches, allowing them to somewhat see. And of course, they may not just be greenish or tealish. They may develop into multiple colors, like red and yellow and other colors, as is the case of many algae. And they may form vast mats of carpets. This will be the first multicellular plant, and they will predominantly be a tealish color, which is very, very nice. Now, you've probably already seen it that we were going to do the scientific names of all the organisms at the very end, but I'm going to go ahead and just say this right now. Their scientific name is the Limus cychinurus. I think I said that right. Probably not, but I'll put it up in the screen here. And they grow vast mats, sometimes even stretching for miles. However, one of their descendants is a very interesting plant. These may develop, instead of being sludge-like, actually have a more defined structure. Their structures may be similar to that of an earth lily pad, and they may reproduce somewhat similar to that of kelp or seaweeds. They have bulbs at the end of these long two-trunk roots, and they use the bulbs to pop, releasing spores. These spores will then grow on the top of the water, forming vast mats of these oceanic lily pads that use a teal color. These plants can grow relatively large for their time. So, plants are growing and adapting, and so are some strange organisms at the bottom of the sea. Some of more plant descendants may grow on the bottom instead on the top, developing two broad stems with long filamental leaves. These leaves may have on the ends of them bulbs. These bulbs will pop during the mating season and release spores that will then grow into a new individual. Again, very similar to that of seagrass or, stuff like that. If they cannot do this, they will reproduce asexually by spreading out their roots and growing into new plants, which is quite nice. So the plants and other organisms are diversifying exponentially. But, this is kind of boring. Nobody wants to see plants adapting like this, and the strange chemosynthetic organisms at the bottom of the sea. So we're all here, I hope, maybe, I don't know, but for the animals, right? Well, of course, the animal cells also might be developing multicellular structures in order to aid them in adapting and surviving, thus resulting into the first zooplankton. Some of the zooplankton may look like blobs that can swim. Others may have more defined mouths. Others may look like strange worms. And others, they may resemble plankton here on Earth, kind of like the Cyclops, with long bunny-like heads. Well, they don't really have a defined head. I guess they do, but it's strange. However, this specific species of plankton right here, maybe by sheer luck or maybe by some other thing, will be the dominant group of plankton and will give rise to some of the most extraordinary stuff that this planet has ever seen, thus resulting into the first multicellular animals. These strange animals, which we'll call the nonopods, which I should have been mentioning all of the other organisms' scientific names. However, I will put them on the screen and mention them at the end. Don't worry, that's my bad on my part. But we will call these organisms the nonopods, derived from the number 9, because they have 9 tentacles, somewhat similar to the 9-armed starfish. You can find these organisms slowly slinking along the side of the seabed. Underneath each of their 9 tentacles is a snail-like foot, allowing them to slowly inch along and sort of be kind of small, and slowly slink around. And underneath them is a small mouth that they use to snug up marine snow and other things of the sorts, which is mainly what they're feeding upon. If you were to cut one open, you would find the simple nervous system. The nervous system allows them to detect stimuli, like if something is attacking them or if they're mating, and it is all powered by a simple nerve net. This simple nerve net is very similar to that of jellyfish, and while they don't have a brain yet, they may develop one in the near future. Soon. They also do not have eyes yet, but they have simple, strange chemoreceptors around the ends of their tentacles, allowing them to somewhat smell chemicals. They also have blood. The blood is powered by a strange heart that pumps blood throughout arteries, or sort of tubes. Now, their blood will probably be very primitive and not the most efficient just yet. Their blood will most likely be purple, which, while of course is not the most efficient blood, is what they'll be using, because, it's the most efficient yet, as they're the first organisms to develop blood. This is the stomach. The stomach connects straight down to the mouth, and is what usually causes the great big bulging. However, where's its intestines at, and where's its anus? Well, it doesn't have one yet. As I said, it's very primitive. So then, where does it poop and release its fecal matter? Well, it releases it out of its mouth, which I guess is sort of not even a mouth at this point. Instead, it's used for 3 purposes: eating, mating, and, expelling fecal matter. But I hear you say, what? Mating too? What do you mean? That's right, they mate out of the same hole as well. This is the female one. The female organ contains unfertilized eggs. And once they find a male, they will lay the unfertilized eggs and let the male fertilize them, and then go about their day. The male is a sort of two sacs that pump gametes out of the mouth, and then are spewed out onto the eggs, fertilizing them. So when the two partners meet, they meet via chemoreceptors during mating season, near their gills, which are near each segment of the limbs. Once they find each other, they will then, of course, mate. The female will lay unfertilized eggs in a small pit, where the male will then fertilize them by spitting out gametes. Once the eggs are fertilized, they will then hatch relatively quickly into the larvae. Now, this strategy, which they lay thousands of eggs, is called R selection, when life forms lay a lot of eggs, not like cage strategists, which are what we are. So, you can find these life forms laying thousands of eggs. The eggs will then hatch out into a larva. The larvae are small and polyp-like, looking very similar to that of coral polyps on Earth, except they're motile. They swim around and feed on small zooplankton and phytoplankton, grabbing with their 9 tentacles and then passing it into their mouth. They're so small that they can barely even swim across the current, thus making them a large plankton themselves. So they're not very, good, I guess, at swimming around. So, we have the first animals, which are strange, starfish-like organisms, which we'll call, of course, the nonopods. However, while these organisms are good with their breeding and stuff, they may give rise to a descendant. Due to overpopulation, marine snow may actually start to dwindle in numbers. Of course, not completely stopping, far from that, but it may sort of dwindle, and thus resulting into the first descendant of the nonopods. This organism, which we'll call the Stomiophyxus, is a very strange life form. Now, it may seem strange that it's so tall, but it's actually sessile. Sessile being an organism that cannot move. Very similar to earth anemones, which these organisms sort of look like. These organisms extract their long, feeding 9 tentacles to gather up marine snow that is falling through the ground, before the organisms that can actually move around to sort of eat it. So they get the marine snow first, before any of the organisms dwelling below can. Now, there's got a problem. How can they mate? They can't move to go find a partner, so how may they mate? Well, they may mate by spewing out gametes from their mouth and just having it drift along the current until they meet each other. This strategy is known as broadcast spawning, when they spew out gametes in hopes that some of them will reach adulthood. Once the larvae hatch, they hatch out into a strange little life form. This life form is actually a free swimmer. It's a very large predatory plankton that uses 2 fins to swim and has 6 fins. The 2 fins are smaller flaps near the mouth that aid in turning. However, they're very small, and they eventually grow up in tentacles. They all eventually become feeding tentacles of the sorts, or except 1 tentacle. It's very strange on how their tentacles grow, but it's what we have so far. Eventually, then they grow up into adult, feeding on marine snow before any life form can. With their feather-like gills, they can breathe and still have purple blood. And that's about it for this first episode of the project. And in the next episode, we'll discuss how some radiosymmetrical organisms develop into bilateral symmetrical organisms, meaning that it's almost like a mirror image on the side, instead of being more like a starfish. We'll also talk about the first eyes, as well as the first predators. And as you can see, these life forms have been developing quite nice. And as I said before, I forgot to mention the scientific names of the life forms. So, for the strange chemosynthetic eukaryote, we'll call them the bulbocultur. And for the strange lily pad-like plant, we will call them the Phylliototilus. And for the other plant that develops its big long leaves, we'll call it the Bulboradix. And with that, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!